very pleased to introduce to you Ms. Danielle Lang, Senior Director of the Campaign Legal Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she is the leader for the Voting Rights Division. It is dedicated to safeguarding the freedom to vote. She litigates in state and federal courts from trial to the Supreme Court and advocates for equitable and meaningful voter access at all levels of government. Danielle is a 2012 graduate of Yale Law School and a 2008 graduate of New York University, where she earned a bachelor's degree with honors in European Studies. Danielle is a member of the District of Columbia, New York, and California bars, as well as the bars of the United States Supreme Court, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, Sixth Circuit, Ninth Circuit, and 11th Circuit, and the United States District Courts for the District of Columbia and the Central District of California. She joined Campaign Legal Center in 2015. I know that you are getting ready for a real treat from a brilliant civil rights attorney. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. First, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to the African American Heritage House and Chautauqua for inviting me to speak with you all and spend some time at this amazing and really unique place. I did not know anything about Chautauqua when I was first asked to potentially speak here, but my husband, who's from the Buffalo area, did, and he leapt in excitement about this opportunity and said I absolutely had to take it. And I'm so glad that he did, because I am so honored to be among such incredible speakers and to learn from everyone here and in this incredibly beautiful location. I am, as you've heard, a voting rights lawyer, and I spend my days thinking about and fighting to preserve access to democracy. So perhaps it will not surprise you to learn that when I was thinking about this week's theme, Can the Center Hold?, I didn't really think about the center as kind of the center of our politics or something about moderation, but rather the center is something much more foundational, our multiracial democracy itself. After all, the winds of our politics will shift and change and go from one direction to another, but at our core, the story we tell ourselves is one of peaceful self-governance. So can our multiracial democracy hold in face of the extraordinary pressures that it's facing today? That is an existential question, and perhaps it will not surprise you to learn, as somebody who's fighting in the trenches every day for democracy, that I hold on to great hope about that answer, but I'm not certain of it. In recent years, there's been a sharp escalation of the political weaponization of access to the ballot to curtail the growing political power of voters of color. And in service of this anti-voter agenda, politicians have peddled lies about the security of our democratic institutions. These lies, in turn, laid the foundation for Donald Trump's big lie that the 2020 election was stolen, and his flagrant attempts through the courts, the media, and ultimately through fomenting a violent insurrection to resist the peaceful transfer of power. Our systems held in 2020, but after January 6th, I know that many Americans, myself included, have found themselves questioning the stability of a democracy that we once took for granted. But sitting here today as a speaker for the African American Heritage House, I know and I'm reminded that Black Americans have never taken American democracy for granted. My thinking today is guided by two truths about America's experiment with democracy. The first is that we owe the creation and sustainment of our democracy to the Black Americans that fought for it with their blood, sweat, and tears. And the greatest threat, and second, the greatest threat to our democracy is the persistent reactionary backlash against gains in Black political power. As I'll describe more today, that has been true time and time again at pivotal moments in our history, and it's just as true today. In her opening essay for the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote, "Black Americans have been and continue to be foundational to the idea of American freedom. More than any other group in this country's history, we have served generation after generation in an overlooked but vital role. It is we who have been the perfecters of this democracy. And without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic efforts of Black Americans, our democracy today would likely look very different, and it might not be a democracy at all." Looking at our history, that much is undeniable. And looking towards our future, I have no doubt that Black Americans and their allies in the struggle for a more perfect democracy will continue just that project. One thing I know for sure is that nothing is guaranteed. We will get the democracy that we fight for, but no outside institution, and certainly not this United States Supreme Court, will safeguard democracy for us. But the remarkable resilience and unlikely success against incredible odds of Black Americans' struggle for representation and voice in our government gives me great hope in the face of difficult odds. In the past few weeks, we've celebrated two American holidays, July 4th and Juneteenth, the latter very belatedly recognized by our federal government and most institutions. And these two holidays in juxtaposition expose the contradiction of America from the very beginning. On July 4th, we celebrate the launching of a battle for American democracy, but of course, the government envisioned by the Founding Fathers was something far afield from what we would actually consider to be a democracy today. Not only could only a small landowning population of white men participate in the democracy, but the Constitution itself sanctioned the institution of chattel slavery, depriving Black people, a fifth of the population at the time, of the very life, liberty, and pursuit of justice that the Founding Fathers had declared inalienable. As Justice Kagan wrote recently in a dissent in a voting rights case, democratic ideals in America got off to a glorious start. Democratic practice, not so much. Meanwhile, on Juneteenth, we celebrate the anniversary of June 19th, 1865, when news of the abolition of slavery finally reached the 250,000 enslaved persons in Texas. That was nearly 3 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And finally, America was on the precipice of making good on some of its idealistic promises. If we want to understand our current moment, I think we should start with understanding Reconstruction and the era immediately following Civil War and the abolition of slavery. During Reconstruction, we, albeit briefly, experimented with a meaningful multiracial democracy. This progress, of course, did not come easily. It was the result not only of a bloody Civil War, but Black Americans seeking political participation post-Civil War did so at great personal peril. In September 1868, and this is just one example of so many, over the course of about 2 weeks, white men in Opelousas, Louisiana, killed around 250 people, mostly Black Americans. Why? Earlier that year, Louisiana had ratified a state constitution that gave the right to vote to Black men. The goal of the Opelousas massacre was to suppress turnout among Black voters and anyone that supported Reconstruction efforts. One report counted up to 34 massacres during the Reconstruction era in which white mobs attacked Black communities, largely for the purpose of suppressing the Black vote. But Black Americans persisted, and with the protection of federal troops, saw great success during this era. Congress passed and the states ratified, upon coercion in the South, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment established birthright citizenship and guaranteed equal protection of the laws. And the 15th Amendment banned racial discrimination in voting. This was a radical shift in our constitutional order. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments cannot be understood as any way as kind of reviving and renewing and dramatically changing our charter, our Constitution. and it could have and should have been the definitive reimagining of our political community. And for a while it was. As George William Curtis, the editor of Harper's Weekly, wrote at the time, we did transform a government for white men into one for mankind. In 10 of the 11 former Confederate states, approximately 80% of black male voters were registered by the summer of 1867. And from 1870 to 1898, 22 black men were elected to the US Congress, 2 in the Senate, and 20 in the US House of Representatives. But this era of progress did not last. The federal government largely abandoned the project of Reconstruction, removed the troops from the South as part of the corrupt bargain that secured President Hayes' election in 1877. And reactionary forces sought an era of redemption, by which they meant a return to white supremacy and the removal of rights for black Americans. And due to this backlash, the great hope of Reconstruction gave way to what we call the Great Nadir between the 1880s and 1930s. And as the North turned a blind eye, there was a reign of terror that you perhaps are familiar with, run by the Ku Klux Klan and mobs and violence, but also through state-sanctioned and legal forms of discrimination. Southern states passed new constitutions with the explicit purpose of disenfranchising and subjugating black Americans. For example, in Alabama's passed a constitution in 1901, John B. Knox, the president of the convention, stated in his opening address, and what is it we want to do? Why it is within the limits imposed by the federal constitution to establish white supremacy in the South. The president of the 1890 Mississippi Constitutional Convention said it plain. Let us tell the truth. If it bursts from the bottom of the universe, we came here to exclude the Negro, and nothing short of that will answer. And I can't help but note here, and you'll hear this more in my remarks later, many elements of those constitutions remain in law today. In fact, the Supreme Court just denied reviewing in certiorari, denied a writ of certiorari, trying to review the constitutionality of the disenfranchising provision for criminal convictions that was in that 1890 Mississippi Constitution. And that was written for the express purpose, and everyone agrees, was written for the express purpose of disenfranchising black Americans. So the project of undoing this era of redemption is far from over. At the same time, of course, states also passed black codes that led to rampant criminal convictions of black Americans that then led to convict leasing and what has often been called kind of a new version of slavery during this era. But something, might confuse you if you're a lawyer, which is that certainly these constitutions violated the Reconstruction Amendments, the Civil Rights Act, and other Reconstruction-era laws. So where was the court? Not only did the court not protect black Americans, but their decisions during this era debased the meaning of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in ways that we're still feeling the impacts of today in their precedent. Certainly, I know you all are familiar with Plessy versus Ferguson, and the court can tell a happy story about it kind of seeing the light in Brown v. Board of Education. Plessy v. Ferguson, of course, is the case where the court blessed segregation under the theory of separate but equal. But there are many other cases that have a long shadow that I think it's important for you all to know about in this time. In the Cruikshank case of 1876, for example, the Supreme Court annulled the convictions of 3 men growing out of a massacre in Colfax, Louisiana, in which a white mob killed almost 300 black Americans during a dispute over the state's gubernatorial election, in what had been called the bloodiest single act of carnage in all of Reconstruction. Yet the court annulled the convictions, holding that the 14th Amendment did not give the federal government power to protect the newly freed men from outright murder. Rather, even though the 14th Amendment was ratified specifically to provide for the equal rights and protection of black Americans, the court concluded it only restricts actions taken by the states and not of oppression by individuals, even when individuals commit the very acts of oppression that had necessitated the 14th Amendment. In so holding, the Supreme Court made it nearly impossible for the federal government to protect Black citizens by cracking down on members of the Ku Klux Klan and similar actors. That state action requirement is still the law of the land, and it was repeated in the civil rights cases in 1883. And in that decision in 1883, the court, in pretty shocking language, although language that I think rings familiar to those of us following the court today, the court back in 1883 said, quote, it was time for Black Americans to, quote, cease to be the special favorite of the laws. The opinion has not been overturned, and in fact, the court reaffirmed this reading of the 14th Amendment in United States versus Morrison, a 2000 case striking down parts of the Violence Against Women's Act. And finally, Giles v. Harris is a 1903 case. That's a case that I think answers my question about where was the court when it comes to the 1901 disenfranchising constitutions of the Deep South. The Supreme Court rejected a challenge to Alabama's 1901 Constitution, which contained almost every qualification for voting ever devised by the mind of man. Jackson Giles, a Black voter who had voted from 1871 to 1901, was then found himself denied by a registrar in 1902. He asked the court to require the registrars to enroll him and other qualified Black voters. And Justice Holmes dismissed the case in an 11-paragraph decision using what scholar Rick Pildes has called, quote, the most legally disingenuous analysis in all of the pages of the U.S. reports. Holmes reasoned that forcing Alabama to register Giles would, quote, make the court a party to the unlawful scheme, and in any event, the Supreme Court was supposedly too weak to act, and any relief would be, quote, an empty form. So they ordered no relief whatsoever. Such was the priority afforded to Black voters by the Supreme Court. And these cases are just as much a part of the court's DNA and institutional history as Brown v. Board and its progeny. And it should be front of mind now as the court continues to roll back efforts to create a thriving multiracial society. Democracy would not return to the South for nearly a century, and it would not come from the largesse of Congress or the Supreme Court or Northerners. It would come about as a result of the remarkable organizing and protest movements of Black Americans. But even in the midst of the Great Nadir, Black Americans never gave up the fight for equality and a rightful place in our political and social community. Long before the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, Black civil rights advocates were planning and strategizing and laying the foundation for the work that would come to fruition in the 1950s and 60s. They advocated for better working conditions and fair educational opportunities and formed civic organizations that would prove critical to the movement's success. In the early 1900s, organizations such as the National Negro Business League, Tuskegee Institute, both led by Booker T. Washington, Alpha Phi Alpha, the oldest historically Black fraternity, and the NAACP were all founded. The Selma Voting Rights Campaign, the roots of the campaign that organized the March in Selma in 1965, started all the way back in the 1930s with the founding of the Dallas County Voters League. World War II accelerated social change. It illuminated the unfairness as Black Americans were serving in the war, yet facing discrimination at home. The fight against fascism kind of exposed the contradictions at home in the treatment of Black Americans. And by the end of the 1940s, as a result of the pressure created by the Black community and Black veterans in particular, President Truman had issued orders instituting fair employment practices in the civilian agencies and desegregated the armed forces. And in 1949, Thurgood Marshall filed the first of a series of challenges to school segregation that would lead to the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. But even as advocates won so many important civil rights victories, access to the ballot remained elusive in the Jim Crow South. 10 years after Brown v. Board of Education, vanishingly small numbers of Black people were registered to vote in the Deep South due to the brutal repression and legal chicanery, literacy tests, poll taxes, registration requirements. And even as freedom riders launched voter registration drives and civil rights movement focused on access to the ballot, the barriers were nearly insurmountable. So largely shut out of traditional forms of political participation and representation, Black activists organized in Selma. And on March 7th, 1965, they marched in Selma and spilled blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday. And it was that day in our history that created pressure that the president, Congress, and federal courts could not deflect. Selma was the heart of an Alabama county that had 15,000 Black citizens, only 156 of which were on the voting rolls. That's less than 1%. While President Johnson had told Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. just before Selma that it would take at least 5 years to get a Voting Rights Act through Congress, it passed only 5 months after Selma. The mobilization of Black citizens and their allies ultimately resulted in what we call the crown jewel of the civil rights movement, the Voting Rights Act, a federal law that fundamentally reallocated power between the federal and state governments for the supervision of voting rules throughout the South and set the country down a path, once again, realizing its democratic ideals and fulfilling the promise of the 15th Amendment. And the law provided a wide range of protections to ensure eligible voters are not denied the right to vote on account of race, including the Section 5 preclearance requirement, which took all of the jurisdictions that had historically disenfranchised Black Americans and said that if you wanted to change your voting rules going forth, you had to first submit those changes to your voting rules to either a court or to the Department of Justice to pre-clear them. And let me tell you why that was so important, is because in the years leading up to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Department of Justice was trying to do something about the disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the South. But it was like whack-a-mole, right? They would pass a grandfather clause, they'd take it up to the Supreme Court, they'd win. They'd strike down a grandfather clause, and up would pop a literacy test. And they'd go to this, they'd spend a couple years litigating that issue, get that taken care of, and once again, whack-a-mole. And so what the Voting Rights Act did was it wiped away all of the kind of known forms of disenfranchisement, said no literacy tests, no poll taxes, no grandfather clauses, et cetera. But advocates by that time understood the strategy of the South and said, this isn't gonna be good enough, because once we wipe away all of these requirements, they'll come up with a whole new set. And so they said, we're gonna first wipe the slate clean. We're gonna create a set of rules that are fair by getting rid of all of these discriminatory requirements. And then for these jurisdictions that had proven themselves unable to treat Black Americans fairly, they said, if you're gonna change the rules, you have to first get those changes pre-cleared by the federal government. And the results were astonishing. The impact of the Voting Rights Act was immediate and dramatic. Nearly 1 million Black voters were registered within 4 years of passage, including over 50% of the Black voting age population in every southern state. The Justice Department has estimated that in the 5 years after the Voting Rights Act's passage, almost as many Black Americans registered to vote in those 5 years in the Deep South as in the entire century before 1965. The number of Black elected officials in the South more than doubled from 72 to 159 after the 1966 election, just 1 year after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And while it was federal law supported by the president, written by Congress, and enforced by federal judges that created this immense change, this huge step towards a meaningful democracy would never have occurred without the pressure that created the necessary conditions for its passage. The Voting Rights Act reflected a fundamental shift in our understanding of the Constitution that was directly attributable to the constituencies who demanded that shift. Ultimately, the 1965 Voting Rights Act ushered in America's first era of truly inclusive democracy. I say that because there were a couple other important amendments in the meantime, like, for example, the ability for people like me to participate in democracy. Nearly 200 years after the founding and 100 years after the Civil War, perhaps we were approaching the lofty ideals of documents like the Declaration of Independence. But the story I'm telling by now should be somewhat familiar, that the backlash to the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the multiracial democracy it ushered in began almost immediately and continues to this day. Each time this backlash rears, it manifests in an effort to restrict the scope of democracy and to reverse the gains in political power. And we are living through such an era now. And while there are many facets to this movement, I'll focus here on three that I think intersect. First, attacks on the legal protections for American democracy, an increase in anti-voter legislation, and fomenting of distrust in our elections. Starting with the attacks on legal protections for democracy, the constitutional attacks on the Voting Rights Act happened right away. There were challenges to the Voting Rights Act filed, moments or within the years directly after its passage, but the Supreme Court repeatedly rejected those constitutional challenges and upheld the VRA. And when the Supreme Court actually did dilute some of the Voting Rights Act's power in the 1980s by requiring plaintiffs to prove discriminatory intent rather than just the impact of voting laws, Congress stepped in and overrode them with amendments to the Voting Rights Act to make very clear that the Voting Rights Act is meant to protect against any system that results in Black Americans being unable to participate equally in our democracy. And the Voting Rights Act was repeatedly reaffirmed by bipartisan majorities. The last reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act was in 2006. It was signed by President George W. Bush, and it was passed unanimously in the Senate. We have landed in a very different place just 15 or so years later. And those legal challenges to the Voting Rights Act have now found a very receptive audience in this court. Indeed, some of the fomenters of the backlash against the Voting Rights Act now sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. Chief Justice Roberts has been opposed to the Voting Rights Act all of his career. As a young staffer in President Reagan's Justice Department, Chief Justice Roberts wrote a memo to the Attorney General, urging that violations under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, quote, should not be made too easy to prove, since they provide a basis for the most intrusive interference possible by federal courts into state and local processes. And the chief had an opportunity and took it to undercut the success of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. And some of you may be familiar with this decision as one of the most important decisions of the Roberts Court. It was a case in 2013 called Shelby County versus Holder. And in that case, the court struck down the preclearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act. So that part of the act that I told you was so important because it was going to make sure that this whack-a-mole game of discrimination could not continue. It was struck down on the theory that, quote, times have changed. As I was reading the Shelby County decision and preparing for these remarks, what I remarked upon the most is that the opinion itself recognizes that times changed because of the Voting Rights Act and because of its protections. And yet, there's this direct contradiction where the court says, and now the times have changed, we should get rid of it. And it did so by relying on something that they called the equal sovereignty of the states doctrine. That is a doctrine that had really not been used since the Reconstruction era and post-Reconstruction era I was just talking about, and was not part of the modern court's jurisprudence. And Justice Ginsburg wrote at the time, and she was entirely right, that throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing your umbrella away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. 2016 was the first presidential election we have experienced in the modern era without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And the court was not satisfied in stopping there. Just 2 years ago, the Supreme Court decided a decision called Brnovich, which was about the part of the Voting Rights Act that's left, which is Section 2, a part of the Voting Rights Act that is a nationwide ban on discrimination in voting. And it's supposed to be just that, a nationwide ban on racial discrimination in voting, full stop. And there was a challenge to a number of provisions in Arizona that undoubtedly had led to disproportionate impacts on Latino voters and Native voters. And yet the court reversed a finding of the Ninth Circuit en banc, finding a violation of the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and kind of erected all of these barriers to proving a claim under Section 2. Said a mere inconvenience is not enough for a Section 2 violation. So, under the court's jurisprudence, you can set up mere inconveniences that only affect Black voters, and you have no claim under Section 2. There was a focus on the size of the impacted population, regardless of the disparate impact. So, if the challenged practice only affects maybe 2 or 3% of the voters, but does so disproportionately aimed at Black voters, you're not likely to succeed in a claim anymore. But we know that today's elections and our political decisions are decided at the margins, that we can manipulate electoral results at the margins through disproportionate discriminatory impact. And these guideposts are made up from whole cloth. Justice Kagan called the decision a law-free zone, and she said, in countenancing an election system, the majority departs from Congress's vision set down in text of ensuring equal voting opportunity, and it chose equality light. And I could continue. There's any number of decisions from the Supreme Court that have devalued the right to vote generally, and especially the right to vote for Black Americans. But the sobering conclusion is that not only is this court not a place where voters can look for additional protection, but just as in the post-Reconstruction era, it is actively diminishing the hard-won legal rights of Black Americans. So unsurprisingly, and emboldened by a Supreme Court complacent to voters' complaints, states have passed increasingly restrictive anti-voter laws that predictably and consistently disproportionately disenfranchise Black voters. In the immediate aftermath of Shelby County, on the day that Shelby County was announced, the Texas AG announced that they would start enforcing a voter ID law that had been blocked by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that very day. Later that year, North Carolina said, we had been working on this kind of smaller set of restrictions on the right to vote, but now that we don't have to deal with Section 5, we can go forward on the whole bill. An omnibus bill that a court eventually held was surgically and with surgical precision was aimed at Black voters. They took data on what types of voting opportunities do Black voters use, early voting and whatnot, Sunday voting, and those were the areas that they chose to restrict. The Leadership Conference Education Fund has identified 868 polling place closures in formerly covered jurisdictions. The result has been that lines in minority precincts are twice as long as in white ones, and that a minority voter is 6 times more likely to wait more than an hour to vote. And this trend has continued and accelerated post-2020. 19 states enacted restrictive voting laws in 2021. And as of November 1, 2022, Reuters estimated that over half of eligible voters in the United States live in a state with new voting restrictions. Georgia, as you may have heard on the news, passed a law making it a misdemeanor to hand out water and food at the polls. There have been stricter voter ID requirements, limits on early voting, cutting hours of voting, limiting third-party engagement in civic participation. And finally, fomenting distrust in elections. To justify these increasingly harsh laws, anti-voter politicians have for many years been fomenting distrust in our elections. This narrative that our election systems are vulnerable to corruption and stealing is always aimed at, either implicitly or explicitly, at implying that Black voters are the ones stealing and corrupting our elections, hence the repeated references to Philadelphia or Atlanta or Milwaukee. Trump and his allies, of course, accelerated this discourse both in 2016 and 2020, and it reached a fever pitch in the post-2020 landscape. This discourse, wholly fabricated and steeped in dog whistles, undermines the fabric of our multiracial democracy for the crass purposes of politicians, and it serves as a thinly veiled justification for increasing attacks on political participation. So what now? As the poem goes, and as the story I'm telling shows, things do indeed fall apart. But I do believe that the center can hold, but only if the best of us have conviction. We must have the same passionate intensity as democracy's foes. I tell my students every year that the thing that gives me the greatest hope is the fever pitch of this reactionary moment has led more Americans than ever to understand the threats that we are facing and to become engaged. When I started this work, voting rights was not the fodder of regular news coverage or dinner table discussion. It is today, and the energy and outcry from the majority of Americans that still believe in this great experiment of multiracial democracy is what can safeguard it. And I think there's a couple of recent examples I want to point to give us some hope about what engagement in this idea of democracy can mean. In 2022, most of the major election deniers that ran for office lost. Congress has not managed to do much lately, but they did pass the Electoral Count Reform Act in order to safeguard our presidential elections. States, especially blue states, are stepping forward and improving their elections. We've seen that in New York State recently. There are states, New York passed a state Voting Rights Act last year, and other states are following suit. And the Supreme Court, I think, has heard the outcries too. We had incredibly surprising results out of this term that I think can only be directly attributed to Americans standing up and pushing back. In Allen v. Milligan, there was an incredible threat that the Supreme Court might strike down or debilitate the part of the Voting Rights Act that we have left. And instead, Chief Justice Roberts wrote an unequivocal decision upholding Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That is very surprising coming from that chief and this court, and I think it can only be attributed to the organizing that was done on the ground. And so I'll leave you with a quote from Reverend Jim Wallace, who says, I say, here's how you can recognize a member of Congress. They're the ones walking around with their fingers up in the air, and then they lick their finger, and they put it back up to see which way the wind is blowing. And you can't change a nation by replacing one wet-fingered politician with another. You can change a nation when you change the wind. You can change the way the wind is blowing. It's amazing how quickly they respond. And we've got to now be wind changers, not lobbyists, but wind changers. Thank you all very much.
African American Heritage House is a nonprofit organization. We exist because of the donations and support of volunteers. So we're always looking for more. Yes, sir.
I want to ask her, did you get your insight for the last comment from Bob Dylan?
I wish I could say that I did,
Did you
but it's a
want to
good point.
repeat that? I don't know.
Oh, yeah, the question was whether or not that Bob Dylan inspired my last thought about blowing in the wind, and I'll go ahead and take credit and say yes.
Okay, great. All right, here's a question. As a lawyer, what probability do you give for Trump being convicted of the documents case or any of the other cases? I need to say this. We are not a political nor religious organization. We are nonpartisan. So that was a question that came out.
I truly don't know. It's obviously a very serious case with very serious allegations. I think there's a real question about what the timeline is going to look like for any of that, which will probably be pretty important to understanding what's going to happen. We're just going to have to wait and see.
Another question is, we hear of Black Lives Matter. Has the organization had any impact on the number of Black voters?
I think absolutely. You know, I don't have great figures in front of us, and you know, one thing that's really hard to measure about kind of the impact of any particular organization on turnout is that there are so many factors in any given turnout year, right? Like Black Voters Matter, which is an organization that I think is, you know, is part of that larger Black Lives Matter movement, does an extraordinary work on engaging Black voters. But of course, the quality of candidates, whether or not they engage Black voters, is all going to matter to an individual turnout in an election. But you look at cases like Georgia, where we've seen kind of extraordinary Black turnout in recent elections. I think it's a combination of them having candidates that they believed in and the work of organizations like Black Voters Matter, like organizations like Fair Fight, led by Stacey Abrams. It's undeniable that kind of tapping into some of the political issues that young Black Americans care about is going to lead to greater participation.
Wonderful. So, Danielle, how did you choose to commit your life to advocating for and protecting the rights of the most disenfranchised people to vote? How did you decide that?
It's a great question, and I can't pretend to have kind of charted out a specific course all ahead of time. You know, in undergraduate, I was very interested in politics, and I was animated by a sense of injustice all around me, in the inequality that I saw around me. I tried my hand at kind of volunteering with some campaigns in college, and I quickly learned kind of politics was not going to be my best way to participate. And so I found myself in law school, where I had incredible mentors. And I think that you can go to law school and you can kind of just read the books and the case law, or sometimes if you have the right mentors, it really opens your eyes to some of the things I tried to talk about in my speech today, which is the ways in which the law has actually sometimes been a force for good, but just as often been a force of reinforcing injustice. And that if you want to be a lawyer and be in the profession, you have to commit yourself to fighting that. I went and worked for a legal aid organization for a while, where I feel like I saw firsthand that when folks don't have political power, they are exploited in every other part of life. I represented largely undocumented workers in low-wage jobs that were being paid, sweatshop wages. And so I saw what happens when folks don't have political power. And then I had the opportunity to join the Campaign Legal Center, and I saw that as an opportunity to get at the root of some of those systemic problems.
Thank you. You talked about voter suppression acts in various states. So this question wants to know about voters having to carry with them photo IDs in order to guarantee fair elections. What are your thoughts about that?
I won't be surprised to hear that I'm not a big fan of voter ID laws, but I think that the biggest issue with voter ID laws that I think gets lost purposefully in the rhetoric is that the devil is in the details here. Right? So let me give you the example of the Texas voter ID law. The Texas voter ID law picked and chose what IDs count, right? It said driver's licenses count. Concealed weapon licenses count. Student IDs don't count. Government employment IDs don't count. And so when you looked at that and you looked at the racial breakdown of what IDs counted and what didn't, it was pretty obvious what was going on. So this isn't just a kind of generic question about should we have some sort of identification requirement for voting. It's a question of how are we manipulating our rules to disenfranchise specific sets of voters. And we were able to prove the evidence at with such compelling facts on the ground that a very conservative Fifth Circuit upheld the violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in that case. But the thing that was just so disheartening about the Texas case is that law went into effect the day that Shelby County was decided in 2013, and we didn't get relief until the 2016 election, which means that there were so many elections in the meantime where a law was in effect that everyone agrees was discriminatory. So I think that is what you'll find a lot of times when you look at voter ID laws, is that you go under the surface and you'll see discrimination kind of in plain sight.
Do you have any particular suggestions as to how we can overcome voter suppression?
Sure, I have lots. Start with voting, but I imagine that most of you do that if you're asking that question. Get engaged with local civic engagement groups. Forget about the national groups. Where you can make the most difference is right at home. The League of Women Voters is a favorite of mine. The League of Women Voters is everywhere, and they are so engaged, and they are tapped into what their communities need. They're providing direct services to voters, making sure that they're educated, helping with rights restoration. The NAACP chapters do much the same type of civic engagement work. So find the civic engagement organizations in your home community and work with them. Volunteer to work as a poll worker. There is a real dearth of poll workers out there, and we are facing a world where there are foes of democracy these days that are also trying to sign up to work in our elections, and election deniers that are trying to sign up to work in our elections. Go work in the administration of our elections. It's so valuable. And then, of course, just stay engaged. Let your local politicians know that you care and you're watching their record on voting. About the kind of wind blowing, politicians need to know that the wind is blowing in favor of democracy. And they need to keep hearing that, right? In 2021, Democrats introduced H.R. 1, the Freedom to Vote Act, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and made them top priorities. Those bills, unfortunately, couldn't get over a filibuster and haven't passed. But we need to remind them that they can't stop trying, that it can't be a one effort and, it didn't work and we're gonna pack our bags and go home, but that the voters demand that they keep fighting for them.
Thank you. The November 22nd election in Georgia had record turnout and resulted in the re-election of Chautauquan Raphael Warnock. Is that because the change to Georgia voter laws wasn't as bad as we thought, or was it because it motivated more voters?
It won't surprise you to know that I think, among other things, it's number two. And this goes back to one of the things that I said earlier, which is that it's so hard. You can't look at the turnout in any election and say, that's because there's some direct line between this law and this turnout, right? And it is the common refrain of, I think, my opponents to say, look, there's been high turnout, so these elections can't possibly be so bad. But of course, we don't know what the counterfactual is of what the turnout might have looked like in a world without these laws, without kind of the boots on the neck of voters who are trying to access the ballot. I think all this turnout tells us is that people care, people are engaged, people are willing to wait 4 hours in line sometimes to vote. That means that we have an electorate that cares about our democracy, and we should have a democracy that responds by caring about its voters and providing easy access. So I think the 2022 election tells us that Georgia advocates and voters did their job, and I wish that the Georgia legislature would do its job by making sure that all voters can access the ballot.
Thank you. Wouldn't providing absentee ballots help Black voters have a stronger presence and eliminate the difficulties of long lines and ID hassles?
Yes, is the short answer. Listen, we can't get rid of in-person voting. In-person voting is incredibly important for a lot of communities. It's very important for a lot of disability communities. There's some disability communities for whom at-home voting works really well. For others, not so much. They might need assistance, for example. They might need language assistance, for example. We can't get rid of in-person voting because there are a lot of communities that really care about the act of voting together in community, activities like Souls to the Polls, ways in which communities have this as an in-person activity. But it's also undeniable that more mail-in voting creates more opportunities for voters. It allows us to meet voters where they are. Some voters might want to vote in person, some want to vote by mail. We have the technology and ability to do both. Why wouldn't we? But unfortunately, there are a lot of states that still have a lot of restrictions on vote by mail. There are a lot of states where you can only vote by mail if you have a certain sanctioned excuse. In Mississippi, you have to kind of get forms notarized if you want to vote by mail. So some places it might make it easier. Other places, it's, Alabama and Mississippi, try to vote by mail. It's a maze. So it really depends on where you are. But if we could move towards a world of universal mail voting access, we'd be in a lot better place.
Thank you. Speaking of voting, when you exit today, please go to the voter table, if you would. There is a postcard writing campaign to the state of Virginia because of the, quote, craziness happening down there. Okay. So we are postcarding to BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, People of Color voters in Virginia. There are 20 card pickup packs for you to pick up. I want to say to you today, on behalf of the board of the African American Heritage House, that you have very effectively done something that I think is difficult in some instances, and that is you've provided a real picture of what structured racism in this particular form is, how it is. So we've seen that. We applaud you for it. I applaud the audience today. I thank you again for coming. If, for whatever reason, you could not send your question via your iPad or phone, you could have written it down. Did I miss a question? Oh, you have a really good one? Okay.
Quick. Quick.
The third-party involvement, what are those things look like? Is it like picking a bus to the polls?
Yeah.
Repeat the
Yeah,
question.
so the question was kind of what does third-party involvement in access to the right to vote look like? And is part of your question kind of like what do restrictions look like on that as well? Okay, yeah. So, and one of the examples you gave was kind of like providing buses to the polls, and absolutely, I would include that. Transportation to the polls is 100% one way in which third-party groups try to make it easier for voters to overcome barriers. Those mailers that you get that sometimes maybe feel a little frustrating when you get so many of them around election season, but the mailers you get from folks with voter registration forms, with information about how to vote, with information about how to vote by mail, with voter registration applications included and absentee ballot applications included in the mail to provide you all of that information. That's third-party civic engagement work. When there are tables set up at events like this that say register to vote, we'll help you. Just fill out this form and they'll turn it in for you. Those are kind of important ways in which third parties help with civic engagement. Voter registration drives, I would say, is the kind of quintessential example. And it is the quintessential place where states have been cracking down. I can tell you that in states like Tennessee and Florida, for example, they have tried to pass laws that basically make it a crime to engage in civic voter registration activities. That if you set up a voter registration drive, if you haven't done everything just right, pre-registered with the state, followed a whole bunch of bureaucratic red tape, you could find yourself prosecuted. And so unsurprisingly, groups don't want, the volunteers at the League of Women Voters who've been registering thousands of people in Florida every year are now terrified to do so. I represent the League of Women Voters of Florida in a case challenging a number of these restrictions, and they have actually stopped distributing paper applications because they are afraid of what could come until these laws are fully enjoined. And so they've switched to a place where they'll only help people with online registration because that's less restricted, but that excludes anyone without a driver's license. It excludes people who aren't comfortable with that technology, and it is not the way that they want to do their work. So I represent the League in a bunch of states in these types of challenges. These are First Amendment violations in my view. It's not just a question of the right to vote, but civic engagement, kind of going around and telling your community members, I think you should vote, and here's why it matters so much that you vote, and here's how to do it. There's nothing more core to the First Amendment than that. And we've been successful with that theory, and we're going to keep pressing it in court.
Thank you very much.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.